So tonight, this is a standalone topic just for tonight that I wanted us to talk about. And that is the issue of polarization in our country, in our community, in so many churches, and even between nations, of course, right now. You may have noticed that there is an increase in polarization all over the place in the last few years. And it seems to have carried forward into American Christianity, where some churches are taking such strenuous stands on certain issues that they actually end up saying, you're either with us on this or you're against us, which means they're drawing a line in the sand and saying, if you don't agree with us, you're our enemy. And if you do agree with us, you're our friend. That makes for some unholy alliances sometimes. And it makes people into enemies that have no business being enemies at all. So that's a real problem for a church today. I could make the case that this probably was heavily influenced by the rise of Jerry Falwell's moral majority, but it was going on in other circles as well. But really, I don't think that kind of polarization is ever what Jesus had in mind for his followers in churches as the years were to roll on by. And if you think about it, Jesus was constantly being tempted to get into these polarizations and to side with one group or another. For instance, the Pharisees always wanted Jesus to take some kind of a Pharisaic stand on certain issues. Temple priests wanted Jesus to claim that there's no such thing as, wanted Jesus to take an issue on things that were interested to them. Sadducees wanted Jesus to claim that there's no such thing as resurrection from the dead because that was a central tenet of what their beliefs were. Lawyers wanted Jesus to denounce Caesar and Roman occupation. And it's even at one point suggested that John the Baptist begins to wonder whether Jesus is really the Messiah or not, because he's not acting like John thought the Messiah ought to act. In every case, Jesus refused to step in and take sides, except when it came to advocating for oppressed peoples, when it came to the poor, to people of different nationalities that were looked down on, to the downplaying of the importance of women and children. On those occasions, Jesus would step across the divide in polarities and become one in solidarity with those who were oppressed. Polarization, therefore, has always been around, and it's still very intense today. How then should followers of Jesus respond to it? What do we first need to understand? So that's our topic for tonight. Tell me what you see in this image.
Two things, Kent.
What do you see?
Well, one is two people apparently arguing with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is a chalice between them.
Yes, right. And it's not, most of us have seen this emblem or this drawing before, so we know how to view it both ways. But when you've not seen it before, you may be instantly seeing it one way and not the other until somebody points out the other way to see it. And once you see both ways, it's kind of like, oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I see that now. Let's try that with another one. Tell me what you see in this picture at a glance.
Somebody running in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe not running, but he's on a path in the snow, and there might be a building back there behind him. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
That's exactly what I saw the first time I looked at it too. Did anybody see something different?
I see a face, a dog's face or dog.
Exactly. A giant black poodle running toward us. Think that if you look at it for a minute, and you may be able to see that too. Now, for this one to work that way, I've discovered that if you make it much larger than I have on screen, you can really see it's a dog. So it has to be at a certain size in order to create that fuzzy distinguishing between two different possible views there. And maybe that suggests to us that sometimes we make snap judgments that are good, and sometimes we make snap judgments that are not complete and not fully informed. So we all can see things in different ways. Here are some of the recent headlines that we've seen that suggest about half of Americans see things one way, and the other half of us see things in a very different, sometimes diametrically opposed way. It can be healthy to have different points of view. We can learn from one another and enhance our understandings. We can become aware of our blind spots and use them as a cautionary tale about arriving too quickly at conclusions that might be faulty or incomplete. The divisions in our country and in our world are glaring and deeply disturbing at present to many of us. There's often no space allowed for compromise. The other, the person who sees things differently from us, is frequently, almost fanatically painted as the enemy. As for us, we can easily see the blatant hypocrisy of the other side's point of view and easily recognize their own blindness and sometimes even what we think of as their selfishness. But it's much harder for us to see our own limitations and to recognize our own hypocrisy. The blinders that we all wear can often be quite significant and sometimes even alarming. And of course, it's risky even to bring up any number of topics in mixed company. Think of Thanksgiving dinners with the family or a church potluck. There are some things that you just don't want to bring up in that kind of conversation unless you want trouble. At this point, Americans can't even agree on how bad the division is in our country. Some are sure we're headed for another violent civil war. Some are sure that it's already underway, and others insist vehemently that such a thing is not even on the horizon. About 8 years ago, an article came out that has started to be recirculated again recently, and it indicates that there may be different ways that people are wired to think and perceive their world. A team of scientists studied the brains of liberal, moderate, and conservative people and found that they could tell who leaned left or who leaned right based on how their brains responded to disgusting pictures. I do not have any disgusting pictures to show you tonight, so you can relax about that. The findings were originally published in the medical journal Current Biology, and they showed that the brains of liberals and conservatives may be wired differently, and it shed light on the biological factors that could be at play in some of our political beliefs. Many of the topics at issue in certain political ideologies, attitudes towards sex and gender orientation, towards family and education and personal autonomy, for example, may have an emotional component just as much as a logic-based one. And some of the research has indicated that political leanings can actually be inherited, much in the way that height can be inherited, although modified by such factors as nutrition and environment. I find that really interesting. Don't have time to go into it or look at further research that political leanings can be inherited. But I remember a few years ago, there was research that seemed to suggest that many children tend to have more in common with their grandparents than they do with their parents. I can't think that could possibly be a uniform observation across all situations, but it was observed that sometimes that's true. But anyway, all this research was actually done in Blacksburg, Virginia at Virginia Tech. A team of scientists tested 43 volunteers to, first of all, learn their political leanings. And then the researchers put those participants one by one in an MRI and had them look at 80 disgusting, threatening, pleasant, or neutral images. And they watched how the participants' brains reacted. Later, the volunteers were asked to rate how disgusting, pleasant, or threatening each image was. But they found that when people were shown a disgusting image in particular, say one of a mutilated animal body, the conservatives' brains reacted much more strongly and in different ways compared with the liberals' brains. I don't know what that means or the implications of it. That's as far as the article goes. But it does go on to say that the study authors wrote, people tend to think that their political views are purely rational. But they said, our results support the notion that emotional processes are tightly coupled to complex and high-dimensional human belief systems. And such emotional processes might play a larger role than we thought, maybe even outside of our awareness of their influence. In other words, how we see the world, how we interpret what we see, and how we react to what we see are more influenced by our emotional makeup than we might typically give credit for. Sometimes the emotional response overruns the rational thinking brain. So let's think about worldviews for a minute. And let's start with a literal view of the world. It's no surprise to learn that human beings and our communities develop particular ways of perceiving the world around them. There are so many different ways to view a map of the world, for instance, and some of them startle us because they don't place where we live in the perspective that we expect to see it. You might say that when we are not the center of the world, the view can be jarring, and yet these other ways of looking at our planet from other angles are equally valid. The one on screen looks down, and even using the word down is a highly selective term, from the North Pole. But who's to say that's not the most appropriate way to view it? Of course, you could do the reverse and look at the Earth and say the primary way to view it is from the South Pole, where Africa and Australia dominate the view. And then there's other kinds of maps that illustrate different points of view about our planet, such as how vast the oceans are compared to the land. And there's nothing that says our view of the world is the correct one. There's every reason that it could be that upside down to what we're used to seeing is the most appropriate way to view our world. So literally, there are different ways even to view the globe that we live on. And of course, some people don't think it's a globe at all. They think it's flat. So it's no surprise to learn that human beings and our communities develop particular ways of perceiving the world around them. There's so many ways to view a map of the world, and some startle us. But we can learn from each of those. Think of masterpieces of art. We have an example of Impressionism here, and the name of that style of painting kind of gives away a lot about its style and intent. Up close, impressions on a canvas may look pretty or perhaps random, and I love the fact that in most art museums, you can walk right up, almost nose to the canvas, to look at an Impressionist painting. And all you see at that level are splotches of color that seem random, perhaps beautiful, but random and nonsensical. But when you step back from that painting, you begin to see a whole different view. And you begin to marvel that the artist could dab shades of minute difference here and there and know exactly what needed to go where for it to register to us what he or she is painting. So we begin to learn from both perspectives and admire the artistry and talent involved. And inevitably, we're challenged by that experience to wonder how elements small and large help us make sense of what we see and perceive all around us in life. And on top of all of that, different people react differently to art. Sometimes some folks are so reviled and disgusted by what they see that they want to ban a piece of art. And yet others look at that same piece of art and find resonance in it. Some see a message in the details, and others in standing back and taking in the whole frame. Obviously, though, we can all benefit from considering these other points of view. We won't always agree with them, but sometimes our perception is expanded and new learning occurs. All of that comes to play when we turn to the Bible. The Bible presents a variety of worldviews as well, not a singular one. And each one of these worldviews holds its own assumptions about how God interacts with the world. They don't all agree, and they don't always mesh together easily. It starts off that way right off the bat in Genesis 1 and 2. And most of you are quite aware of this, but Genesis chapter 1 on down to chapter 2, verse 4, part A, is one creation story. How God creates structure and organization out of chaos with 7 distinct days and a hierarchy of creation that marches from smaller to larger to the crowning achievement being the appearance of humanity. It's a poetic expression that is largely painted in the abstract. But immediately after that text is a different creation story that begins in chapter 2, verse 4, part B. And they didn't create it that way. That's monks in a monastery in the Middle Ages came up with a poor choice of numbering and lettering or versing. And that second creation story does not concern itself with days or processes at all, but the story of 2 human beings, Adam and Eve. It depicts an intimate God who seeks out human beings for relationships. The 2 stories come from entirely different cultural experiences separated by centuries. Do you think you could guess which one is the older story by hundreds of years?
I think it's the second one.
Yeah. The second one is much more folksy, very human focused, anthropomorphic. It tells a familiar story, something that would be easy to pass along orally when you are a nomadic group of people who travel from place to place, who don't have much, if anything at all, that they can write down. And so stories have to be preserved by orally passing them along. Many scholars believe that Genesis 1 came out of the Babylonian exile when, as we talked about a year or so ago, so much of what we have in our Old Testament today was shaped by that reset experience of what does everything we know from our history and heritage inform us and tell us about where we are now. And being in a different culture and learning their understandings of creation sometimes played a part in expanding their ideas about what the Christian creation, the Jewish creation looks like. And that continued to happen over time, that those things would be modified as new information came to light. So for the Jew, the Muslim, and the Christian, we began Holy Scriptures with 2 different worldviews right off the bat. And they change and grow as new understandings come to light, even down to today. Think about the fact that those early folks didn't even know that the earth was not flat. And they thought it was the center of the universe. And they thought that there was a body of water above the earth, and that would explain how it rained. So our understandings of the planet we live on and how it works have changed over time. In our own church, most of us have long been comfortable with understanding creation as something generated and directed by God, and also at the same time with evidences for evolutionary processes. We understand from science that these things can be easily demonstrated, But from faith, we can see how God could have guided and directed this form of creation to come about. When we jump to the Gospels in the New Testament, the four Gospels, each of those has a bit of a different worldview through which they portray Jesus too. Matthew wants to highlight the Jewishness of Jesus and how his every action fulfills some Old Testament prophecy or psalm. Luke prefers to shine a light on how Jesus breaks with the cultural stereotypes to elevate the role of women and foreigners and the poor. Mark's portrait of Jesus is often cryptic and mysterious, leaving a lot to the imagination. He doesn't even have resurrection stories in his gospel. John, probably writing 70 years after Jesus and into the third generation of churches, presents a Jesus from a point of view of what does all this mean theologically, retelling the whole story in a new way. And interestingly, all four of those, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, came about decades after Paul wrote his letters. Paul was writing in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. Mark probably around 70, Matthew and Luke 75 to 85, and then John after that. So Paul's writings are the earliest ones we have, the closest to the actual time of Jesus. But he rarely ever mentions any specific teachings of Jesus or any of the stories of Jesus that we have. Occasionally, I'll be reading in Paul and I think, I'll bet he's thinking about when Jesus said this or did this. But he never directly references those things. So that may mean that there were other sources about Jesus that were well known in those early churches so that Paul didn't have to tell those stories. And they all could refer to them because they knew them so well. But we don't have any of those today. And take all of that. And some scholars now wonder if all of Paul's heavy doctrinal emphasis in his letters ended up influencing how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John later put their stories of Jesus together, which stories they selected, which stories they chose to set aside, and how they told them. So we get lots of different worldviews and lots of different views of Jesus in our New Testament. And nevertheless, we still get to learn a lot about Jesus, not just from one of them, but from the diversity of all of them coming together, each arising from a different cultural context. And together they help us have a broader ability to take a 2,000-year-old story and find relevance for it in today's world. Each denomination today, of course, has its own view of what should be emphasized about Jesus and the life of disciples and congregations. Ours, by its very name, says baptism is really important to us. The Mennonites are among a small group of denominations that especially think about how Jesus intended for his followers to practice peacemaking. These would include the Brethren and the Quakers, who were the first to recognize the immorality of slavery. These groups are keen at this time of division in our country, that is the Mennonites, the Brethren, and the Quakers. They're keen right now to help us understand one another better and to find more creative ways of dealing with division. And so what I want to share for the rest of our time this evening has to do with their thoughts about how we can better appreciate other points of view and find places where we can move forward together. To say we as individuals or a group of persons holds to a worldview implies that we have most things figured out. So that's the first thing we need to recognize. When we say we have a worldview, it sounds static. It sounds like we have a better understanding perhaps than others. And it's natural for us to feel this way. And yet it can feel very threatening to others who don't share that same worldview with us. Even if it's just in the nuance of some of the details. Think about Baptists who have divided and divided and divided over again. And there's a likelihood that I may have already said something tonight that's caused a little ripple in your worldview. Changes and challenges to a worldview can really feel threatening, and they come in an uncomfortable manner most of the time. And yet, as we encounter new events or uncover inconsistencies in the way we make meaning, most of us actually can modify our worldviews fairly smoothly. And so it's been suggested that what we should do is not claim that we have a worldview, but to understand that we are always in the process of worldviewing. That's a more dynamic and active way to think about the process of forming and reforming our outlook. It allows us to modify our filters for how we process what we see, hear, read, and learn. And if we take this worldviewing at its most literal level, we process the onslaught of what our senses tell us through an enormous amount of data so that we can make sense of and organize our values and our perceptions. So the worldview of many folks has the potential to modify frequently and sometimes to change dramatically. So worldviews really are not static most of the time, not locked in forever. We are forever observing, viewing the world, and processing it. And so when we enter into a discussion with another whose worldview is different from our own, with this understanding, we begin not with a noun, but with an active verb, world viewing. At a deeply unconscious level, there are 5 questions that we are always asking ourselves. First, what is real or not real? And you can immediately probably think about the fact that these days that's been subverted into what is fake news and what are facts. Now, that framing makes it hard to have an honest discussion with a person of a different worldview because they can easily dismiss our truth as delusional, and we feel the same about theirs. But beyond this, we're always processing. Could this thing I'm witnessing on this TV show actually be the real experience of some people? If we've never known spouse abuse, but we witness it on a TV show and it's harsh and it's shocking, something in us begins to think, is this what it's really like for people who go through this? And it begins to affect our worldviewing. At one time, putting Black players on the sport team raised questions for some along the lines of, can they really be as good as white players? Or is this just being done because of some outside pressure? So those are just poor examples of many times in life when we are always thinking, what is real and what is not? What is important and what can I discard and move on without? A second question is, how is the real organized? In other words, how do we make sense of all that we perceive? In a smaller framework, Isaac Newton took certain phenomena that he observed and formed it together into a theory of gravity. What happens if we have theories that work for us based on what we've observed, but then our understanding of the real gets exposed for some flaws? Well, we usually scramble to tweak or even replace the perception that we have held to about how the real is organized. And folks who struggle mightily to answer these first 2 questions are people who often will struggle a lot emotionally. And there's also this: people who live in fear of losing their sense of what is real and how it's organized often become defensive and perhaps even belligerent. And politicians are quick to weaponize those fears. Vladimir Putin is doing this right now at the Ukrainian border. What he is saying to the Russian people is, if Ukraine is allowed to remain free, they'll join NATO, and then our enemies will be at our border with missiles and armies aimed at us. And to many Russians, this seems like a legitimate fear that must be addressed. The third question to be considered is, what is valuable or not valuable? And we actually are filtering things through this question constantly. It's exhausting. Hoarders might be an example of people who don't do very well at answering this question. But most of us quickly discard what we decide are less valuable things as irrelevant so that we can stay focused on the truly important. We rank things pretty quickly. The fourth question is, how do we know about the world? Seeing is believing should never be our sole standard for judging what is true or not. But what we see and hear and read does highly inform what we know about the world. And to me, this is where public schools and colleges should be majoring on training young minds in critical thinking. They should be helping us learn, helping kids learn to ask, how reliable is this source? What is the speaker's agenda that shades the way they present their material? Who stands to gain from history being written in this way and not that way? When Matthew's telling of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem is at odds with the way Luke tells it, and the two cannot be matched up together, who's more believable? And why do they tell it the way they do? For that matter, when we look at the resurrection stories in Matthew, Luke, and John, they cannot all be matched up. They are very much in discord and at odds with each other in many cases. What does that mean? Does it mean none of them are trustworthy? Or does it mean we need to think differently than just on the literal level about what is being presented to us? Critical thinking is, to me, a defining element of whether a society thrives or declines. The final question that we are always using to filter truth in our worldviewing is, how should we act? Interestingly, just because we assemble a certain way of viewing the world and build a certain system of values doesn't mean that we are really good at consistently adhering to it. We're pretty good, but we also sometimes mess up and fall or are hypocritical and don't recognize it. The role of good teachers and preachers is to knock the props out from under us that make us think that we're consistent when we're actually far from it in the way we treat others. And this past Sunday was a good example of that in terms of the theme of loving your enemy and the hard teachings of Jesus. I've had several conversations with church members about that this week. It really struck a chord. It really resonated in a way that people said, man, I didn't want to hear that, but I needed to hear that. And one of the interesting things that was observed is it's one thing to think of a theoretical level, I should love Osama bin Laden, whatever that might mean. It's an entirely different thing when you think about if you have a family member who is intent on doing you harm and nothing you can do stops them from their intent. They are persistently trying to harm you. That's your enemy at that point. And yet, what does it mean when Jesus says, love your enemy? That's the kind of challenge that pastors and teachers are always meant to put in front of people. And that's what they said in seminary is, we're here to create upset for you. And your job is to go back to churches and take it to them. It's the same way. It doesn't happen always because we like our jobs and don't want to get chased out of town. But we all need to be shaken up sometimes. And Jesus was very good at shaking people up. Our answers to these 5 questions have the potential to help us form a fairly coherent system that influences us in how we respond to the world. Worldviewing gives us a sense of the moral order of the world, of our obligation to others, and what we can expect or require from others. For many of us, worldviewing is informed by our faith tradition. Creating moral order out of our worldviewing is a complex task and exhausting. We sometimes value things that contradict each other. When it's overwhelming, healthy people know they sometimes have to step back and reaffirm the hierarchy we've given to our values. We value this and this and this, but right now, this value takes priority. Later on, a different value will take priority. And Jesus did the same thing. Jesus prioritized healing and teaching and training disciples. But when the crowds became overwhelming to Jesus, he then prioritized solitude and would retreat to a time alone with God in prayer. He found ways to achieve and maintain balance between values that sometimes conflicted with each other. Creating and maintaining a worldview and a moral order is also challenging because we may be surrounded by other people who share the same values we hold, but they may rank them in a different order of priority. And that is enough in itself to cause perplexing conflict, even within a church or Christian community or within a marriage. Think about in a church, how many people would absolutely say, yes, we value community ministry, beautiful worship, and evangelism. But when you sit all of those people down at budget time to prioritize the dollars that go to different ones, there's usually disagreement about the proper order and priority of those because different people have ordered them differently. So within like-minded groups that still have conflict, we can help diffuse that polarization by identifying first the values that we share and celebrating them, and then explore why we prioritize them differently. Chances are people have stories to tell that shape why they prioritize the way they do. And when we know their stories, we can understand, appreciate, and sympathize their different ranking of values from ours. And at that point, we can get a lot further down the road together because we know the other understands us better and we understand them better. And we're more likely to give and take and be more respectful toward each other and patient. This is, by the way, part of why diversity has so much to offer to those who are willing to participate in it. Different experiences in life brought to light help us all to see a bigger, more complete picture of humanity and community in community together. So sometimes changes in the world make us become more rigid in our worldview as a defense against anxiety and threat to our identity. Rigidity is amplified when politicians and pastors and other leaders of influence claim that to modify our understanding of the world would be a threat to our very existence. Excuse me a second, I've got a tickle in my throat. But when we back ourselves into a corner, we hunker down and we give up on learning and growing. And we exchange a dynamic worldview for hunkering down to protect the status quo. The truth is, the status quo only ever needs to be protected by those who benefit from it because it works for them at the expense often of others. When conflicts with others turns our world around, it's best not to immediately tackle worldviewing conflicts first, but instead to ease into fruitful reflection with questions like these. You might ask, when did you first doubt something that your community had always told you was true about the world? Because that's happened to everybody. You might also ask, did you ever experience a time when you believed two things, but something happened and you learned both could not be true at the same time? What happened? How did you deal with that? And then a third one would be, have you ever encountered a situation for which you just didn't have an explanation? How did you make sense of it? With questions that are open-ended like that, we're forced to listen to the answers And the person that is asked the questions is being given the message, I'm interested in how you have come to the things that you think. What has shaped that? Because there's validity to what has driven you to the position that you hold most of the time, I guess. Okay. So in conclusion, as reflected in Genesis, Scripture testifies to the potential for members of the same community to hold different worldviews. Rather than reinforcing worldviews as rigid and unchanging, people of faith can cultivate worldviewing as a process through which God's Spirit continually invites us to move into a new dimension of awareness of the world, of one another, of ourselves, and of God. In our highly polarized society, we can't expect to win others over to our view completely, because they cannot win us over by forcing us to give up the values that we insist upon. What we can do instead, though, is we can work toward something that is a little bit more mutual understanding of where the other is coming from, and highlighting the places where we do agree with one another. And at that point, we're often able to treat others with more kindness and respect. Now, normally I don't like to do that much presentation without discussion, but it was a lot to cover tonight. And so I just plowed right through it. I had discussion questions buried into it and I skipped right over them. But what are your thoughts about all of this?
Well, we could spend a whole semester discussing these concepts.
Yes.
First of all, I mean, you made a nice outline. It could be gone basically to, it could be a ongoing seminar or ongoing discussion. There's so much of this that's relevant both in our personal lives and both our international relations and so on. I mean, it's really something that I think everybody, thinking whether you're a Christian or not, should be addressing these issues.
Yeah, I felt somewhat hypocritical even presenting the material, because there is a part of me that wants to be right and wants to prove others completely wrong every single day. But probably you feel that way too.
I think it's the human condition. You wouldn't believe the things you believe if you didn't think they were right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you still had questions about it, you wouldn't be so strong in that belief.
Right.
So it's hard to counter that with, okay, I could be wrong. I'll listen to somebody else. And we pass this along to our children sometimes in our concern for the kind of acquaintances and friends they have. We don't want them hanging out with people who are, not, we sometimes say they're not like us, or they have strange beliefs. So, because we don't want our children to have those beliefs. And yet something in us tells us that that's the wrong way to look at it.
That's right.
And you know that, I know that, but I haven't always been able to refrain from thinking that way and saying those things.
When my boys were teenagers, they both diverted away from our youth group a little bit at times to go with their friends to much more fundamental oriented churches. And it bothered me, but I needed to let that happen. I needed for them to see that other experience and to process it too. And that might be something that's one illustration of what you're saying, Kay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Lydia?
I think this is a very appropriate subject for this particular season in the world and in the time we are in. There's so much out there to be considered, and I think we need to consider it from God's point of view as much as we can, and not just how we were raised and what the habit is of thinking that way. I think we need to weigh issues. There's an awful lot out there today.
I have often played the advocate with myself of asking myself, and this was before everything just blew up in the last few years. When we look back at previous generations, sometimes we think, how could you not see how wrong this was, like slavery? And then I ask myself, what am I blind to today that people will say that about me 50 years from now? And it's really hard to get a good answer on that. It's hard to see in the moment. Jan, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think we make a big jump toward the 5 questions in a way that you had. When we say to ourselves and force ourselves to not be formulating an answer and cutting somebody off before they finish talking. And when we will force ourselves to stop and just listen and process what it is they're saying, not to be formulating an answer at the same time.
My problem is I forget what I was going to say when I listen. Yeah, that's really crucial too. And I think a lot of us can tell when somebody is already thinking about what they want to say next instead of listening to what we're saying.
I think that's the situation where, what's the expression, you talk past one another?
Yeah.
You know, neither person is really listening to the other. They're saying sort of what they've prepared to say regardless. And that's one of the reasons I think we are in the mess we're in today. Besides, to me, the hardest thing about today's controversies is figuring out what is really truth, what really did happen, or what is a valid explanation for what I'm hearing, or was this statement taken out of context? And how do you find all this out? I mean, sometimes I've just had to withdraw from the whole panorama of stuff out there.
It is
I just can't
exhausting.
take it anymore.
Yeah, it's very exhausting mentally for all of us.
Kent, if you really want to get a good handle on talking past one another, watch NBC, the 3rd hour, which is from 9 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock in the morning, NBC.
Okay.
And watch the 3 or 4 of them go at it, and nobody's hearing the other person. I mean, they might be hearing them, but they're ignoring them. And it's just amazing to me. It's aggravating in a way. But I know that that's the way they are. And I don't know how they get around it.
It must be entertaining too. Because
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
He watches it.
I watch it. Once in a while, they have something good on there.
Watch it from there.
But it's just amazing to watch Al Roker and the other 2 or 3 go at one another, just talking past the other person.
Right. Yeah, and of course, if you're ever in Times Square, you can walk over to the NBC studios and look in the windows and watch all that going on live. Sometimes they even come outside. It's quite a spectacle. Well, thank you all for sharing in this time together tonight. I look forward to discovering with you a lot more about the various witnesses at the cross. And the first one we will look at next week, among many other bystanders and those passing by, is Simon of Cyrene, who was pulled in to carry Jesus' cross. And so we'll think about that a little bit. Well, y'all have a good evening. Stay safe. And if you think that you have any COVID symptoms at all, please get tested. I have some home test kits. I'll be glad to get one to you if you need one. And do let me know if you have something that we would like to be able to track that. I don't expect that that's going to happen, but we'd like to be aware and support you if we need to. And special thanks to Mary Ann for helping us have good wisdom and insight today from the pandemic response team's point of view. They've been indispensable. Yeah. All right. Y'all have a good evening.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you.
Right.